Okay, so part two in our week on social selves, we're going to discuss now norms and deviance. So, throughout the socialization process, um, you've born into a particular part of the world, a particular place. That means that you'll be born into a particular class position, particular genders, particular races. All this kind of stuff plays a role in your socialization, and therefore in terms of the different roles, in terms of that Goffman-esque sense, that you'll be able to take up in the world. And obviously this means that it's influenced by all kinds of forms of inequalities. At the same time as those inequalities, throughout societies, there's all these kind of norms that are instilled that make up those scripts. Values, morals, ethics, tastes, manners. These norms aren't kind of in some social vacuum. They tend to favour some people over others. They tend to be written and invented by particular people with power and privilege, and therefore they, in terms of asking that sociological imagination question, who benefits, tend to benefit some people over others. And this is particularly the case when it comes to the notion of deviance. And as we'll look at here through a critical perspective, notions of right and wrong, law and legal and illegal and all that kind of stuff really help us in many ways to kind of function in a society, in the sense that we know how to behave. It means that we don't have to constantly think about everything that's going on all the time in terms of performing versions of ourselves. But the line between those things often advantage some people over others that doesn't actually often make a lot of sense in terms of fairness or whatever. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. So our scripts, that we learn reflect and favour some people's preferences and social positions more than others. Those people that kind of are learning a script that doesn't really, suit their lives or suit their background and socialisation, and where they essentially sometimes have to perform a version of themselves that is someone else, means that they're kind of put in a very unequal position. And we'll look at this in some detail later in the course when we look at class. So this is how power works across, all levels of our lives. Different contexts, there's different norms. As I was commenting about before, there's different kind of norms in all kinds of little micro settings. Facing the right way in an elevator, talking at the right volume, whether to wear clothes or not, whether that's the beach or at work or different types of clothing. All these kind of norms help us function smoothly, but become problematic for those that are deemed deviant, or deemed kind of or labelled deviant. And again, I'll go into that in more detail in a sec. So deviance in this sense is not necessarily something that's illegal either. It doesn't have to be illegal for it to be deviant. Something that just kind of strays from social expectations can be seen as a form of deviance. When there's some kind of form of social sanction, even if it's just like people reacting, rolling their eyes or sighing or telling them to stop or whatever. So deviance in this sense is on a kind of wider spectrum than just kind of illegal or legal. And really in that sense, most people every day you probably do something that's deviant in one way or another, whether it, you cross the street in the wrong spot, or, use the wrong knife and fork in a restaurant and all this kind of stuff. That kind of deviance doesn't matter as much in that sense, or it doesn't matter to most people that are relatively privileged or are not under the kind of lens of social control. So in this sense, even from that really broad level, you can see how, deviance matters more from some people to others. And I'll discuss some versions of that now. So Howard Becker in particular is a kind of key figure here to think about what deviance is through his concepts of labelling theory. So for Becker, this is really important. Deviance is created by the people who make the rules and who then label anyone who breaks the rules as deviant. So in this sense, you can think about deviance in terms of particular acts, but maybe that act isn't always deemed deviant or illegal or unacceptable or, immoral or unethical. So we can think about those kind of different value judgments and different kind of lines between things, not just about deviance and legality, but also about kind of other social scripts as well. What Becker points out is that the rules tend to be applied differently to different groups and different people. And this seems to be always the case with laws in particular. We all know the idea that, like, you kind of get the legal representation you pay for. If you can afford to have really good lawyers, you're more likely to get off and to be found innocent. Oh, when you're found not guilty, actually, you're never found innocent. And that means, again, in terms of like just power relations, some people are more advantaged than others when it comes to the legal systems, for instance. Becker's own words are worth kind of quoting at length here. So, social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction constitute deviance, and by applying those rules to particular people and labelling them as outsiders. From this point of view, deviance is not a quality of the act the person commits, but rather a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to an offender, in inverted commas there. The deviant is one to whom the label has successfully been applied. Deviant behaviour is behaviour that people so label. So this kind of shifts attention away from the act or the notion of deviance itself, more so to power structures and those that get to kind of make the rules and get to label people in certain ways. So you can think about this in all kinds of different ways, I think. I think in an earlier lecture I used the example of drug taking. So and I think it's in the reading as well. People, rich white collar workers, taking cocaine in their bathrooms at home at a kind of house party is seen very different than, like someone taking ice on the street. The context there changes the level of deviance that one is kind of ascribed. One's in public, one's in private. One's kind of a more kind of upper class drug as opposed to a more lower class drug. Therefore, it's the act itself, taking illegal drugs, has different kind of levels of deviance. Now, you could argue that, like, if the cops came to that house and they saw the people taking coke, they'd probably bust them and they'd get into trouble. But again, that's unlikely. Things that like happen in people's homes tend to not be as policed. And also, in richer suburbs, the police just don't really go around to people's homes. If you're in a kind of lower class suburb or government housing, it's much more likely that your life's going to be intruded upon. Even if, therefore, you're doing the drugs in your house, there's more likely you're going to come into contact with these kind of powerful figures that can then decide that you're being deviant. An example of this, even on a kind of smaller level, is things like, alcohol-free zones. As a 50-year-old white man, if I'm walking up Derby Street with a beer in my hand, where you're not meant to do that, if a cop comes up to me, they're likely just to tell me to put it down or put it in the bin. If I'm a young Indigenous kid, it's much more likely to be confrontational, and therefore it's much more likely for that kid to get into trouble, whereas I'm more likely to get away with it. So the context really matters. Powerful figures and groups have more of a say of what's normal and what is deviant. And in the examples on the screen there, like in colonial settler nations, white people define black culture as deviant. And it's not just the acts of deviance itself, it's kind of the different kind of personality and characteristic traits that are ascribed to these things as well. So in this sense, it's like shiftless and lazy, ignorant, violent, or whatever. Class relations that we'll look at later in the course, it's the middle classes, particularly the professional middle classes, get to define the working class as deviant. They have bad taste. Again, they're lazy, undeserving, bludgers, bogans, that kind of stuff. In patriarchy, men get to define, get to see what's unfeminine for women, and there's various labels attached to that. Rough, dog, slut, those kind of things. And they tend to dominate positions that in institutions where gender inequality is made and policed. You can even see this in terms of age brackets. Adults get to define what's deviant for young people, and we'll do a week later in the course on youth sociology. All young people are kind of narcissistic, or they're irresponsible and all this kind of stuff. These kind of judgments been happening for millennia. So, what's interesting about this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when it comes to thinking about the work of Foucault, once the deviant label is applied successfully, the individual is stigmatized and viewed as an outsider and is tend to be treated differently than from the majority. This is particularly the case when it comes to the crime, and it's particularly important when it comes to socialization. If, as kids at an early age are kind of defined as being deviant, if they're told they're naughty at school and all this kind of stuff, the label often becomes part of their identity and it becomes part of the script that they then play out. So there's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy involved in the labeling theory concepts. So for Goffman, this self-fulfilling prophecy that the individual who's treated as deviant will then take on that deviant identity is a key part of how deviance becomes a thing, how it's patrolled, and how it has kind of then really profound effects on people's life chances. It becomes, in those Goffman-esque terms, how one learns their lines and how one kind of performs themselves. And there's some other kind of subcultural theories about this as well, about how, like, in particular subcultures, what may look like a deviant act may be a kind of an act that kind of earns you cred. I'm sure you can think of kind of movies and stuff like that that kind of portray that kind of thing. And what's particularly interesting about Becker's notion of labelling and outsiders is he kind of lays blame here at some of the professional, white-collar kind of social science trained professions, that they're actually part of the problem. So where, like, people like myself that do research in the world and try and instill knowledge and make knowledge to kind of influence policy to make things better, when this kind of results in labelling of young people, this can have those kind of detrimental effects. So it's particularly useful for thinking about the consequences of these kind of knowledge industries like social work, psychology, criminology, sociology, the legal system, all the human sciences, and youth studies, which is something that I participate in as well. Once a young person kind of becomes, like, under the attention of the legal system, there's this self-fulfilling prophecy where they kind of not only just enact it, but are more likely then to kind of draw more attention. And once someone's labelled that, they'll kind of then take it on and play it out. So, as a consequence of this, any punishment conferred on the young person may not stop their behaviour as intended. The labelling process may actually reinforce a person's identity as a delinquent, as a deviant, as an outsider, and this might actually lead to the increase of that behaviour rather than the decrease. Once someone, for instance, is defined as a young criminal, they're more likely, therefore, to take part in kind of young criminal kind of subcultures where that kind of behaviour is rewarded rather than sanctioned. This means they then embark in what Becker kind of calls a deviant career. So you can think this is important. You can see this is important for thinking about how power works. Even those practicing, therefore, in ways that they think they're doing good in those kind of professional, kind of social science industries, may actually be, therefore, even reinforcing inequalities and discriminations. And so this is a really important thing to consider. As yourself studying sociology, maybe embarking on a social science program or a social work or an education degree, that when you take up that position as a professional in those industries, that some of the things you do may be actually replicating some of these problems. So it's important as in your training to kind of take this kind of stuff into account. You can see that, like, for instance, in that structure agency debate, that teenagers kind of do have agency in this sense, but their choices, their agency may seem irrational or self-destructive, but from their own perspective, those choices might be part of the script that they've learned and been taught and been, in many ways, as Becker points out, almost pushed into from an early age. So we'll look at aspects of this again throughout the course through the lens of issues around gender and race and class, and particularly in the next section I'll be actually looking at it from a different point of view through the work of Michel Foucault that kind of moves a bit beyond the agency and structure binary.